Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us this morning. We know there's not much on your calendar. There's no budget stuff or anything like that going on, so we appreciate you taking some time, getting some breakfast, fueling up for what will promises probably to be a long day in Senate Finance. Thanks again for coming out and joining us. This is another one of the Fordham Speaker Series events. I know I've seen some of you here before. Welcome back. Those who are new, we know you're just here for deregulation, so we'll get to the conversation as quickly as we can. Again, we try to do these about every month. It usually ends up being about every 6 weeks. We expect today's event to be probably interesting for most folks and maybe even a little controversial. If you haven't gotten a chance to take a look at the report, I urge you to do so. About 6 months ago, 9 months ago, when President Faber and Governor Kasich started talking about education deregulation, I don't know how each of you were thinking about that, but everyone I've spoken to sort of had a different vision of what that was. So we thought, it might actually provide a pretty nice service to dig into the issue a little bit and figure out exactly to kind of like, I won't say lay parameters around it, because there probably shouldn't be parameters around deregulation, but for lack of a better word, I think that's what we tried to do. Tried to explore the issue, see exactly what it meant, what it means in other places, and what it could mean in Ohio, and exactly what is good fodder for deregulation and what probably shouldn't be. More and more over the years, I think those who've been following state government have seen that there's been a big attempt to try to drive educational excellence, much of it at the state level, and I think it's had mixed results in many ways. So I think it kind of goes to the old statement that you can't regulate your way into excellence. I think, and we'll have a good local perspective, I think, today on our panel discussion, but I think excellence happens at the district, school, and classroom level. So what can we do to allow that to prosper and to hopefully get more effective classrooms all across the state? Anyway, I won't bore you any longer. I'll bring up Paolo to bore you. No, I'm just kidding. When we decided to dig into this issue, we could think of no one better than Paolo DeMaria and his team at Education First to really explore this. He's had virtually every major role in education policy in the state, great knowledge, great connections. He did this process through reaching out to a lot of the key stakeholders in the state and having some really, really thoughtful conversations. He pushed our thinking. Hopefully we pushed his a little bit on this process, and we look forward to today's discussion. So without further ado, Paolo.
Thank you, Chad. It's great to be with you all this morning, and because I think we all share something in common, right? We come to the work of education policy because we care about kids. We care about kids, and ultimately we want what's best for kids in our state, right? And so we toil away, and we're kind of guided by this beacon in the Constitution, that we hold ourselves as public servants to this idea that we want to work towards a thorough and efficient system of common schools in the state. And so as we put those hats on, what I find to be so interesting about the way we approach that work is, I think in every one of our hearts and minds, there's a little part that desperately wants to find the magic bullet, right? We want to find the Holy Grail. We want to be able to identify that one thing. Oh, here it is. If we all did it, and if all the schools did it, and all the teachers did it, and all the administrators did it, everything would be great. Maybe it's the right funding amount, maybe it's a right, curriculum, maybe it's a right whatever and what have you. And so there's we're instilled with this idea that if we find it and just tell people to do it, everything will be fine. When we were approached by Fordham to take on this project, it ultimately turns that kind of logic on its head. And why our firm at Education First, why we were so excited when this was presented to us, was because increasingly, as we do work across the country, in place after place after place, what amazes us, what attracts us, what intrigues us, and the people that come to work with us, is just how different everything is. Time after time, we see groups of people getting together, teachers and administrators, families and communities, to talk about what do our students need, what's going to help advance their education, and coming to different conclusions. But achieving success by virtue of the fact that they're all working together. They find their own secret sauce. They find their own solutions. They look at what the research has told them, but then infuse it into the context that they're working in, and that's what makes the magic happen. And so as we looked at this project, we really looked at it through a lens of how can we help support that kind of innovative activity, that kind of student-focused, culture-oriented, success-oriented perspective in a way that allows us to still uphold the idea of thorough and efficient system of common schools, but at the same time allows lots of different things to take shape and lots of different ideas to grow and bloom in the interest of helping students succeed. So I'm going to walk you through a number of PowerPoint slides, then I'm going to turn it over to Susan Beaudry, my colleague at Education First. We're going to have a little panel discussion. And I'm just going to walk you through the fundamental, some of the key ideas out of the report that you've received today. The first thing I want to do, though, is I want to set a little bit of context. And that context is that we're still not quite where we want to be in terms of educating students in the state of Ohio. I pulled this chart from the latest statewide report card. It shows all schools. This is a building-based presentation, and the various measures that are used on the report card. So you'll see there's the number of indicators met. Most of you know what those indicators are. You've got performance index and so forth and so on. And you can see that in just about every category, you can show where, while there might be some bright spots, there's really not enough happening at the far right of the graph, of the table. And we might say, well, some of these measures aren't particularly great. They're not particularly powerful. I think the fact that we do have a nice collection of measures speaks to the diligent attention that has been paid to improving accountability in this state and looking at things through different lenses, through different perspectives. But I think we can still agree that there's work to be done. The reality of this table is that the structures that have been put in place unintentionally are perfectly designed to create this outcome. And so the reality must be then that if we want a different outcome, we have to pursue different strategies. And one of the things we're going to suggest is among those different strategies should be some view of deregulation and what might that look like. I think the other point that I want to make while I'm on this slide is that while those graduation numbers, again, we can discuss and debate what the real meaning about those is. There's another set of metrics. If you go to the Board of Regents and look at their reports about the numbers of students that need remediation when they get into college, you'll find that that's yet another indicator that we're not quite where we want to be in terms of educational outcomes for students. In the interest of the change that I discussed, we are engaged as a state in a number of policy areas to drive improved student achievement. And so I tried to create this graphic in the interest of showing just what all is happening out there and how does it all fit together. So obviously we've been having a lot of discussion about standards over the last several years. We're having a current discussion and implementation of new assessments. Again, the accountability system and report cards has received a lot of attention for many, many years and continues to receive ongoing attention. There's been some new focus on teacher quality by virtue of new evaluations and other things similar to that. Funding has been a perennial area where there's been a lot of attention. Choice options, what kind of options do students have in terms of the educational opportunities that they're able to engage in? And then finally, this area of improving instructional practices. Because ultimately where the rubber meets the road is in that engagement between teacher and pupil, between staff and students at the school building level that generates whether or not improved student achievement is going to be materialized. And it's really in that area where we begin to have this discussion about the change that's happening. Whereas many, many years ago, we might have felt like, okay, well, we should prescribe what instructional activity looks like. Now we're increasingly finding that that's the flexible area. That's where different people can come to different conclusions and create different cultures that meet the needs of different contexts and different student bodies in the interest of meeting needs and achieving results. So why are we talking about deregulation, and why are we doing it now? A couple of points that I want to make. The first one is the idea that one size doesn't fit all. Again, we're increasingly finding that that's the case. And how do we know? It's not because I say it, but there's been a good bit of research. Two particularly great pieces of research in Ohio. Fordham's report called Needles in a Haystack that really identified sort of those break the mold schools and tried to dig into what they were doing. And then another report called Failure's Not an Option that was sponsored by the Business Roundtable here in Ohio and done by Public Agenda, which again honed in on those out of the ordinary schools that were achieving incredible results, beating the odds, and dug into what were the various things that those schools were doing. It's a fascinating report, and as you read through it, you'll see that they identified things like leadership and culture, things that are hard to specify in the context of statute or regulation. But all the same were the things that they honed in on, saying, when you walk into a building that's really having an impact on student achievement, here are the things that you're likely to see. And one of the things that came out of that was this whole notion of flexibility and innovation, the ability for a leader and staff to get together, as well as to get together with community members and students, in fact, and talk about what's happening and design the approaches that ultimately lead to an organization that's able to achieve a fantastic result. The second is we happen to be in a place and time where, while not perfect, we have better measurement and better systems of accountability. If you think back many, many years ago, when there was no such thing as a state report card or a building report card or a district report card, some of you might think that was a happier time, and maybe it was. But the reality was that barring any measure of what was being accomplished, the natural intuitive response by state government was to look at inputs, to understand, okay, how much are we spending, how well are we staffed, how many days and hours are schools in session, all these kinds of things, because we really didn't know how to gauge what was happening on the other side. But over time, we began to start thinking through that issue, and as research and practice showed us, we began developing better measures of the outcomes of education, better accountability systems to sort of identify where there was strength and where there was weakness. If you think of where those efforts were at their very origin and where they are now, we've come a long way. There's still yet a long way to go. And there are great efforts across the country where people are looking at additional measures, additional activities that can help drive that. But that's a key factor in this, because ultimately it's that accountability for outcomes and the end product that allows there to be more flexibility in terms of the inputs. The third area is that there's a hunger out there among Ohio leaders for greater flexibility. And again, we base this on some work that Fordham did in terms of their report, Yearning to Break Free, where they interviewed a number of superintendents. Actually, they surveyed all the superintendents in the state of Ohio and asked them about a number of different challenges. And this idea of having greater flexibility and being given the authority to do things differently in the interest of advancing student achievement came out loud and clear in that report. I think the other report that we rely on for learning in this area is the report put out by McKinsey that we reference in the brief. That's how the world's most improved school systems keep getting better. The title alone is a very appealing title because, again, we desperately want to know, how do we make things better? But the key takeaway out of the McKinsey work is that it all depends. It depends on a number of factors. And McKinsey, in their report, spends a number of, a good bit of time talking about this idea of autonomy and when and where it should be implemented, or when and where there is evidence of its impact on student achievement, and we make reference to that. But ultimately, this triad of phenomena and understandings is what really drove us to have this conversation and more deeply engage on the issue of deregulation. So one of the fundamental issues in this conversation then is this idea that we need to start by recalibrating the state and local relationship and recalibrating the roles of state and local government. And you might say, well, but wait a minute, is there really things that are fundamentally wrong? Because We do know and we acknowledge that while we want to sort of wave the flag of local control, that the state government plays a role. The Constitution is clear, investing with the state government, the idea of creating a system of common schools, and so the state has to play some role. All school districts exist and their powers and authorities exist by virtue of the state. And yet, we recognize, and this is a vestige of some fundamental public policy principles, that those governing entities closest to the people are the ones that are most likely to be able to provide the services at that level. And so local control is a long-standing principle of governance and education in the state of Ohio, as it is in almost every other state in the country, and the local government has to play an important part. As we thought about this brief and the preparation of it, we looked at, okay, well, what does the state do and what do local communities do? And is that really a comfortable and appropriate mix in the interest of creating these conditions that allow for the furtherance of innovation and variation? And we decided that what we really want to put, and we describe this in the paper, is put down a principle that what we really want to do is have state government focus on a number of things that are really critical to being consistent across the state, and where consistency is important, and also where variation would not be particularly conducive to improving student outcomes. Okay. So as we looked at the current activities the state was involved in, we said, defining what the ultimate goals and outcomes of the system, that's an important state role. We think of the day when that didn't happen and how that changed over history, and trying to acknowledge that the state has a legitimate role there, we think meets the test of state involvement. But then also to be able to measure whether those outcomes are being achieved and to hold the system accountable for achieving those options. Those are critical and necessary state functions. The next one is setting up the structures of governance. School districts. In the case of Ohio, also empowering charter schools, empowering other entities to be providers of education, and then providing the undergirding finance structures for those governance structures. And then finally, issues of student health and safety. Making sure that things are happening appropriately that allow students to be able to undertake their educational experiences in a safe and healthy environment. On the local side, the fundamental interest is really in the delivery of education. In the context of what the state creates, the local community then has the ability, and we would argue should have an even greater ability, to define how education is delivered. And so this includes things like identifying the curriculum, identifying the instructional models that are going to be used, identifying the textbooks and materials, and ultimately making staffing choices. Because at the level of the school building and the school district, it is this collection of things, and this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, there are other factors that would be involved in this delivery component that ultimately drive whether what's happening in that district or that school is a quality education. So really focusing on recalibrating this relationship. Now, it's important to sort of point out that there is, as we get into this notion of deregulation, an assumption that we make. And that assumption is that we can trust local government. And I've spoken to many of you on this issue, and from time to time, the question will surface about how do we know that districts will do the right thing? How do we know that buildings that are giving greater autonomy will actually make decisions in the best interest of students? And while we don't know, I think there's enough evidence to point to the fact that there is a shared interest in ultimate student outcomes by communities and school boards and others, that at least our default thinking ought to start with people should be trusted. And then, as we'll discuss later, if there are reasons to believe that people can't be trusted, then the state can step in and take action at that point. One of the interesting parts that I enjoyed of the work we did on preparing this was looking at some things that were happening in other parts of the country. We actually focused on some district-level activity and the way districts were deploying autonomy among and between different buildings within the district. And so this was based on a report that was done for Boston that looked at a number of districts across the country. And they teased out a number of key elements of what constitutes good practice in promoting greater autonomy. And so the idea is first having a theory of action. How exactly do the pieces and components of an educational plan fit into improving student achievement, being thoughtful about those things? And we have mechanisms in Ohio that allow people to do that. Districts at the school building level ultimately create a portfolio of autonomy. Where are there places that will benefit? Where are there places that need a little bit of autonomy? Where are there places where they're not quite ready to use autonomy? What are the fundamental structures that reflect that kind of portfolio? Districts that engage in autonomy engage in a restructuring of their central office. Central office is no longer kind of the command and control compliance organization that's about checking the boxes to make sure everybody's doing the right thing. It's more about how do we support schools? How do we support principals and building leadership, including teacher leaders, in delivering against the plan and the ideas for that particular building? Obviously, a focus on instruction and teacher and leader learning is key because ultimately that's where the rubber meets the road. Identifying and developing high-quality school leaders is really critical to success. And I think we see that in any number of examples that we can think of from our own experience. But in the literature, time and time again, that leadership component really jumps out as a fundamental. And then strong accountability systems, including ways to measure progress, ways to identify low performance, ways to then take that information, analyze it, and use it to follow up and improve the outcomes that are being pursued. So I'm going to quickly go through the next set of slides. It's a brief recap of what Ohio is already doing in the interest of providing flexibility to school districts. One of the takeaways from the analysis that we did here was that it's really kind of a patchwork quilt. It's really kind of a collection of not particularly well connected ideas and initiatives that have happened over the years. Our point is to say, hey, we can make more sense of this, and we can drive an agenda that really is more cohesive. So, just quickly, there's a section of the law that says if you're a district that has an A, and again, it's a little bit more detailed than that, but ultimately you can exempt yourself from certain school regulations. So this is a classic example of kind of a blanket exemption that doesn't require the state to approve it. You can grant it to yourself. But it's really reserved for high-performing districts. We have some things that are innovation waivers. There's a section of law that allows for schools to be designated as innovation schools or collections of schools to be innovation zones. Again, quite a lot of process required to actually go through those designations. It does require state approval. It does require the sign-off of different entities at the local level, not very extensively used. We have the Innovative Education Pilot Program, which is another innovative program that is actually used quite a bit, but it's only used for a very small type of thing. It's largely used for adding days to the professional development calendar and using that to lessen the number of days that students are in attendance. As many of you know, Cleveland was granted some special legislation, and in the context of Cleveland's legislation, they were given some authority to grant buildings more autonomy on a number of different education delivery areas. And so we have that as an example as well, but it's really limited to the Cleveland example. Many statutes actually have alternatives baked into the statute that to us represent another example of flexibility. So for instance, on teacher evaluations, there are actually two options that you can pursue. If you're a race to the top district, you can choose an alternative compensation approach. So that to us reflects one element in kind of the toolbox of allowing there to be different approaches as may be conducive to different circumstances. Charter schools obviously reflects an alternative that's baked into the fundamental governance structures and statutes of the state, where you have a somewhat altered statutory framework for how charters operate. One of the things, though, that we find interesting is that while most people will think, oh, it's kind of totally unregulated, the fact of the matter is it's amazing how many regulations actually apply in the charter community, and that you will find as many people working in the charter community that have complaints about some of the restrictions that government imposes on them as well. And then you have alternative regulatory frameworks for schools in academic distress or in fiscal emergency, again, reflecting the state's decision in a very sort of governance-oriented way to engage when certain things are failing at the local level. Finally, there are a couple of mechanisms. One more formal, the 5-year rule review. We've seen some good examples of that being used lately in the state in terms of really digging into old regulations and revamping them. And then legislative review. Less formal in its review kind of mentality. The 5-year rule review is required to happen once every 5 years. Legislative review kind of happens on a, kind of an ad hoc basis, but yet we see good examples of the legislature weighing into this area every so often and making some decisions. Sorry, I went backwards. So let's dive into some recommendations. And in developing these, we tried to be informed by what we were seeing across the country, as well as what we were seeing in Ohio, and the conversations that we had with a number of folks. And we developed, at the end of the day, 4 recommendations. The first one really says what we want to do, what we should do perhaps, is create a more holistic and systemic climate that promotes flexibility and innovation, but retains this idea of strict accountability. And I think what we were trying to put on the table was this idea that we see in the statutes and the actions of government, these different tools that have been kind of proposed from time to time. Why don't we try to be more strategic about it? How could we be more strategic in developing a strategy that ties some of these things together and allows there to be a more deliberate emphasis on it's okay to be different, here's how you can be different, here are the things you can waive if you want to do X, Y, and Z. How might we bake some of the flexibility into things like the Straight A Fund? How might we bake flexibility into other programs and grants, including the way we might manage our federal funds? So the 4 key ideas were, let's spend some time being strategic about how we might foster innovation and promote the adoption of successful innovative practices to scale. And this could also include things like sharing information better, finding ways to bring people together that have an interest in innovation, and nurturing and supporting providing technical assistance to the people that want to do things differently. Which is really the second bullet: publicize examples, disseminate research, provide assistance that not only helps people but allows them to self-assess and adopt alternative ideas. Promote better resource allocation. We find a lot of times that people become stuck in the way they do business by virtue of the way they're allocating their resources. We think the state playing a role in helping encourage people to better understand resource allocation challenges would be part of this climate of fostering flexibility and innovation. And again, the 4th point, continue to focus on identifying better measures. The second recommendation, we tried to get specific, and we dug into the statutes and the regs, and we came up with a number of things that we felt like you could actually eliminate statutes or rules that drive up costs or tie districts' hands, allowing them to be more innovative and flexible in their management of schools. Now, the criteria we used for these was actually, we said to ourselves, if the General Assembly has done something in one place, why wouldn't they do it for other places as well? So what we tried to focus in on was these were not brand new ideas that sort of, oh, we should do this or we should do that. It was like, wait a minute, if the legislature has said, let's take the first one, eliminate seniority as a consideration in layoffs of non-teaching employees. Our logic here was, well, the legislature has eliminated seniority as a consideration in the layoffs of teachers. Well, so why wouldn't it do a similar thing in the interest of layoffs of non-teaching employees? Now, that doesn't mean that people could just randomly go in and lay off at will. I think the point is you substitute that with an idea of what are the qualitative issues that should decide whether a person is the right person to keep when you're in the position of having to do reductions in staff. The second was allow greater flexibility for districts to manage non-teaching staff. And this is, again, based on the idea that in our current time, before a teacher can get tenure, there's a long period of time that's required to get to that particular point. And yet, for non-teaching employees, you're almost able to gain tenure within 2 to 3 years. And our question is, okay, well, why should that be different from one type of staff to another type of staff? Shouldn't we allow that flexibility to exist with non-teaching staff as well? I recognize that the idea of tenure has different nuances between teaching staff and non-teaching staff, but the fundamental principles are largely the same. The third idea was to expand opportunities for schools to use more non-licensed individuals. Again, we didn't pull this out of a hat. There are certain statutes that authorize particularly STEM schools to make significant use of non-licensed teachers. And so, again, our logic was, well, wait a minute, if it makes sense in that context, why wouldn't it make sense in the larger context? And if there are places where a district can provide the necessary support for a non-licensed person, and the appropriate evaluations and what have you, what should prohibit us from allowing that to happen in the context of a thoughtful approach to improving student outcomes? Eliminating districts' ability to collectively bargain away management rights, including the right to assign staff. This is a quirky thing. If you've ever read the collective bargaining statutes in the state, there's this section that articulates all the management rights. And then there are 2 lines at the bottom that says, districts can negotiate these away if they so choose. And what's then also interesting is that when the state goes in with an academic distress commission, it sort of suspends that statute. It takes back all those management rights. And our thought was, why do we allow those management rights to be negotiated away? Let's just acknowledge that these are management rights and that they need to continue to be held by the managerial side of the equation, and that's okay. And we should leave that alone. Teacher salary schedules was another area where, again, we looked at the statute. There are a couple options already in statute, and it was sort of like, well, why do we have to have specific options? Why don't we just let people design teacher salary schedules to best meet the needs of their organizations and their students in their particular context? So while we like the idea of salary schedules that move away from the traditional steps and lanes and begin to incorporate elements of effectiveness, we also recognize that having something that's rigid around what that effectiveness structure might look like still may not accommodate any number of other permutations and variations that schools may want to pursue. And the last one is really this notion of removing teachers. We picked this one up from some of the authority that was in the Cleveland legislation. And the notion was, well, if you have a teacher that's designated as ineffective for more than a couple of years, you have the authority. It doesn't require you, but you have the authority to remove that teacher. And it's sort of like, well, if that's all right for one school district, why wouldn't it make sense to provide that authority to others? And again, this is meant to be sort of an illustrative list of those areas where we think there's opportunity for further exploration and examination in the interest of making progress. So finally, the last 2 recommendations is, the first one is taking a step back from the current structures we have in place and implementing a simple process to allow districts to just waive state regulations in the interest of supporting plans that they've put in place for improving student achievement. So if a district is deliberate about preparing a plan, and this is, it's been thoughtful, it's engaged stakeholders and what have you, why not let it on its own suspend a variety of regulations that fit into those categories of inputs-based regulations? And the rest is a description of that, with this final bullet being that the state could maintain some kind of fail-safe mechanism, a process whereby district actions could be reviewed by the state based on information received, and the state could come in and say, you know what, we're not exactly sure that the way you've suspended these regulations is appropriate in the interest of students and what have you, and play a role. But it becomes the default mentality is that you trust the district to be making the right choices in the interest of students. And then finally, this recommendation emerged from, as we watched the process unfolding around the current budget, we sort of said, it's interesting, people put ideas on the table and they go to different legislators and they say, here's what we need, and then those things get processed and people talk to each other, and it's a very informal mechanism that ultimately leads to something appearing in a piece of legislation or a bill that says, here's some deregulation that we'd like to pursue. We said, why not make that a little bit more formalized, give it a little more structure, and allow it to be a little broader in its consideration. So why not, as a build-up to any particular budget process, put together a little review process where you solicit input from the broad range of stakeholders. You put together a small review panel that's made up of appointees that really don't have a stake in education, aren't working directly in education, and have them make some thoughtful recommendations for modification or elimination. And work that, as part of a process around some guiding questions and framing of the issue for them. So that really wraps up the fundamentals of what you see in the report. Again, as Chad mentioned, we know that what we've said here will be, can be in some ways controversial, but in some ways that's really what we're trying to do is provoke people to have the conversations that need to be had. Because I think we recognize that the state is doing some very interesting and exciting things, both in terms of state policy around innovation, but also watching many districts doing wonderful things in terms of using flexibility and autonomy. And we think we can accelerate that and ramp that up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Susan Bodery and the panel that's been gathered, and we'll engage in some discussion.